In 1934, I would believe, someone who was here in the Jupiter Island, Hobe Sound area also was involved in Zellwood for some reason. I've never quite figured out why. His name was Frank Stott. And he told my dad about a possible job opportunity down here. And at the time, my father was working on a large, very wealthy estate in Zellwood, on the Lachlan family. And so he had a little bit of experience and knowledge, and so he came down and interviewed with Mr. Reed, who basically, Joseph Vernon Reed, pretty well has established the Jupiter Island Club, he and a few partners. And he was offered the job, so my parents moved down here, and sometime in, I think, it would have been 1934, I'm sure. And they moved on to the estate on Jupiter Island of the Reed family, which was called Artemis. And it was a huge estate, as many of them were in those days, went from the river to the ocean. And we lived in the caretaker's cottage. So I had an older brother who was born in 1936, and I came along in 1942, and we lived there probably till about 1950 or 51, I would say, on the Reed estate. So a long answer to a short question, but that's what brought us to Hobe Sound. Growing up in Hobe Sound was pretty terrific, probably more so than we realized at the time. Now we can look back and see how it was. A very small area, very small area in population, of course. Out of doors, if you loved the out of doors, you loved Hobe Sound because you had the ocean, the river, you had some lakes, you had not a lot of people to get in your way, a lot of things to do out of doors. So as a kid, it was really great. Because it was such a small community, I would say it was great because you kind of knew everyone. Looking backwards, maybe it's unfortunate, those were the days of segregation. So you had basically a black community and a white community here in those days. So both populations were pretty small. So you more or less stayed in your own area. So my knowledge wasn't many except for some of the men who worked for my father and worked on Jupiter Island, and maybe some of their families knew any black families, but it was a separated group, of course, well into the 60s, I guess. But to give you an example, I like to use sometimes in telling people what it was like about Hobe Sound in those days. It was so small, I honestly don't think it was any smaller than Jupiter. I think we were about similar size towns. I love baseball. I played baseball through college. I loved the game. We didn't have enough boys to form a team probably in at a certain age group here. We had to team with Jupiter to form a 9-person team, So if you look back and think, if you like small, which I happen to, Hobe Sound was a pretty small town. And if you look at now, it's still relatively small compared to Jupiter. So it was, both communities were beautiful in those days. You kind of knew everybody, and you did a lot of things together out of necessity probably, but you didn't realize that at the time. But it was a great place, I think, to live. You didn't have a lot of outside interference. You didn't have, I'd like to compare with today, all the social media and the internet or whatever. You almost didn't know I didn't know what was going on in Stewart, But Hobe Sound, you get familiar with. So it was a great place to live and grow up, and without any, probably not many poor influences, affecting kids growing up. Pretty much one big gas station for many years, which was Diamond's gas station on the corner of A1A and Bridge Road before the railroad tracks. It still exists now, except not as a gas station, but as a car rental and a transport center, if you will. Later on, there was another gas station added on where the Mobile is right now. It was actually a Mobile station on US 1 in Bridge Road. But that wasn't, as I remember, my earliest memory of the area. So if you want gas, you better you're going to be getting one station and that's it, or you want groceries, there's one place to buy, you know. Later on that evolved. There was an old building that stands out in my mind, I should say, that has recently, probably in the last 2 years, been torn down right in the old part of Hobe Sound. It was an apartment building, an old building, kind of rounded around a corner. In fact, just down off of Apollo Street here. And there were apartments upstairs and there were some businesses downstairs. The Chambers Electric was downstairs, I remember. The original post office that I always remembered was there in part of that building. And a Railroad Express, if anybody could remember that, you have to be old to know that they existed. Long before UPS or FedEx or whatever, things got shipped by railroad generally. And Railroad Express Station was down there also in the lower part. And upstairs were apartments where people lived. So I remember that because that was a unique building. It was an old building, and even at the time I think I was a child, it was seen to be old. And that was kind of neat. West of US 1 on Bridge Road, I'm not even sure it was paved beyond US 1 other than by crushed shell rock, which was, in many roads were that way in the 40s, certainly. And eventually it got paved, obviously, but it went out. I mean, it certainly went nowhere near where Bridge Road extends now. So I remember that, going out to fish. There were canals along that road, fishing, you know, riding bicycle out there and fishing, or my father driving out in a pickup truck going fishing. Those were fond memories and a very nice time, and I think Hobe Sound history, at least for me it was. There was someone from Jupiter that when we had joint baseball teams, I could say, I remember a well-known person in the area, Roy Rood, or Buster Rood, they called him. Or I'd say one person stood out. I don't know why he did. He was kind of a unique person. But as I remember as a child, particularly when I was probably, you know, under 12 or whatever, Smitty. His last name was Smith, I guess. Everybody called him Smitty. I have no idea what his real name was or his full name was. But he had a gas station, although it really wasn't a gas station, more of a repair, but he ran a towing service. And he must have come out of the World War II and bought a wrecker. It was a military vehicle, I know, a big wrecker. So he ran that business, which was his prime business, but I guess repairing and all. But he was quite a character, I would say. He did things his way, and he didn't care what anybody thought about it. Not that he did anything that I ever remember offensive, but I would say he would stand out in my mind. Other things that have evolved through the years, and I note something that has happened through the years. There was another family. The boy was older than I. The name was Conrad. His father was a mechanical repairman, or a car mechanic or a truck mechanic. And he built a building down here on South Dixie. And as I remember, I left this area probably in the mid-60s after I got out of the Army. That was my last permanent status here. I lived elsewhere. My parents still were alive, but I would visit. And I remember for a lot of years, apparently that business closed down, they moved away. I don't know what the circumstances were. But that building, when I'd come down and visit, was vacant. And I don't know for how many years, but it must have been vacant for an awful long time. And only recently, a firm has opened up in it and remodeled a building, this old, basically bland building with a couple of roll-up doors for, you know, to bring the vehicles in. And it's an architect firm now, I think a landscape architect. You might know where it's at. And I thought, well, that's a nice touch to an old building that sat there and just sat there and sat there for years, unoccupied for any reason. And since I think they built there's a mural been painted on the side to dress it up, but they do a beautiful thing, an interesting thing, the architecture of the building. And so that impresses me, because they left the roll-up doors there, but they changed them to windows. And if they want to have fresh air in the building, they run up the windows, because I saw them up the door. But otherwise, they had all this light through these very nice windowed into their office area there. And, you know, there's a lot of changes in Hope Sound, but the things that stand out in my mind are little things like that, where something has replaced something else. So those are things I can think of to share with you today about Hope Sound and growing up here and what it was like. We went to school here through the 5th grade. Looking backwards, I guess that was kind of unique. Then go back to the single room classroom of the early 1900s, I guess, but there were 2 rooms. We're in one of the rooms now where the 4th and 5th graders were, and the 1st through 3rd graders attended on the other side of this building. And one teacher taught either 3 grades simultaneously or 2 grades simultaneously. He had 2 teachers. So it's a little bit of difference, of course, as that evolved through the years, but this extended at least through the 40s and 50s when I was in these grades here. And then thereafter that, there was one high school up in Stewart, actually middle and high school. We call it junior high, I guess, in those days. From 6th grade on up, you went to Stewart for your schooling. There was, I think, in each classroom a wood-burning or coal-burning stove, as I remember. Probably coal, I think it was. I think there was a bin as you just go out to my left now into the backyard, the playground, if you will. There was a shed, which I think they stored coal in. So I think there was for heat in the winter when it did get cooler. So you had some heat through that means. The fact that, well, I had no comparison then, that we were all in, you know, in either 2 or 3 grades all together, and the teacher went around and talked to each person according to whatever class they were following, you know. There was a playground outside, and that was a great opportunity, of course, for kids to gather. And it was a gathering spot for most of us, I guess, certainly during the school day. I remember when I started in school, I still lived on Jupiter Island. And so a bus, believe it or not, went all the way down Jupiter Island, and there was another person beyond me, Bob Body, that got picked up. So, you know, the bus was like kind of deadheading 10 miles probably to when you could figure it back there and back to come here. So a bus brought us over to the school. Later on, those of us that, when I moved to Hope Sound, we'd ride our bike to school. So it was a unique school in many ways. Limited amount of teachers, of course. Teachers' names, most of them I can still remember. And you know, it was enjoyable. There was a stage to my back here, which no longer exists, but I have pictures still of, you know, kids in their little capes and was playing triangles and drums and stuff like that, or rhythm band, I think they used to call it. And I think the older kids sometimes would have plays on it. And I think I've seen pictures where even this was sort of the community center too, where there were some plays that actually adults participated in and took place on the stage. So as it is now, it was probably open. I don't remember specifically, but it must have been open to get enough people seated here to see the performances. So it was a pleasant school. Because of school, you knew everybody in the classes, no matter what class they were in, and it seemed to go very well. Well, Hope Sound has changed dramatically, as probably most areas do over a period of time, but certainly the size of it, the amount of people. I don't even know what the population of Hope Sound is right now, but it certainly was well under 1,000 when I grew up, and that's every man, woman, child, and dog, and I think that was in this area here. So there was a lot of open spaces, a lot of places that are built up where the Winn-Dixie Plaza is now. That didn't exist when I was younger. That was all palmettos and pines. Where Publix is, of course, that didn't exist either. So the changes, and in Hope Sound proper too, most of the streets that had been paved and built during the boom times of the 20s and 30s never got developed. So they were there, but there were no homes and people. They were scattered a few homes. So I would say in the greater, what they call the old Zeus Park part of Hobe Sound now, which is pretty well filled in terms of homes. In those days, I would guess if there was 10 Hobes at the most in those streets that go beyond, say, Apollo South to Saturn, back in that era. So, and there was a reason they weren't built on, because Jupiter Island didn't need any more people or whatever to service them, and they owned all that land, so it wasn't for sale. So you couldn't buy a lot and build on it, which kept the community small, which was desirable, I think, from Jupiter Island's standpoint. Many of their people used to go to Palm Beach, I understand, before they came to Jupiter Island, and they wanted to get away from, more people, if you will, and have more privacy. So Hobe Sound was that way accordingly, because it was, most of the land around there was controlled by the Hobe Sound Company. So one could look at it as a blessing or a curse. I looked at it as a blessing because I didn't know any different, and it was great. It was just enough people to get along and do the things we wanted to do. So those changes, population and growth, to what it is now, as small as many people think it is now, it was tiny in those days. Yeah. Pleasantly tiny, I'd like to think. There's a lot of changes in Hobe Sound, but the things that stand out in my mind are little things like that, where something has replaced something else. I'm glad that the railroad depot was never demolished and torn away. It sits out west of Hobe Sound right now on that Polo Club property. I think that was great, whoever thought of doing that instead of tearing it down. I know my parents' home and their neighbor was an Army barracks building from Camp Murphy. And they and their neighbor bought one at the end of the war. It got sawed right in half. They both built homes out of it on Laurel Lane here, and added wings to it to make it into a real home, I guess. They're long gone. There's not many of the barracks buildings left from, or buildings from Camp Murphy, but they were a kind of nice landmark to have around. I think there's only a couple here in Hobe Sound, the Civic Center being one, that still exist. So anybody that's as old as I, or pretty in that vicinity of age, it's kind of nice to look and trigger a memory, of what might have been or what was at one time and what it has become now.